Miko Peled is here. He is an Israeli-American activist and author. He is the author of, sorry, here, my screen. There we go. He's the author of the books, The General's Son, The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine and Injustice, The Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5, and he is also an inspirational speaker. So let's go ahead and bring in Miko. Hello, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm hoping that you can educate people here tonight because I don't know if you know, but we've been very, I think, frustrated a little bit about some of the rhetoric in reference to Israel and Palestine, and particularly from some presidential candidates, so to speak. But thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, Miko, I want to go ahead and get started with this idea that Israel is not, basically trying to commit, apartheid. So, for example, I think one of the disagreements that tends to be, I don't know necessarily on the left, so to speak, but there tends to be a disagreement in reference to whether or not Israel is now an apartheid state. Some of us have tried to make the connection to South Africa and what happened there in reference to apartheid. But we have received pushback from people who tell us that it is not apartheid. For example, someone like RFK Jr. And I want to get your opinion about this. How would you describe it? What's happening to Palestinians in Israel?
Well, again, thanks for having me on your show. And this is a great question to kick off the conversation. So never mind what I think. Never mind what Palestinians have been saying for almost 100 years, 75 years. Last year, Amnesty International came out with a report on apartheid in Palestine. And if anybody hasn't seen the report, it's available online. It's about 200 pages, but there's also a summary. It's a very easy and a very important read. And in this report, Amnesty International makes it absolutely clear that from the moment the state of Israel was established, it was engaged in a crime against humanity. Apartheid, if people don't know, apartheid is designated as a crime so heinous that it is designated as a crime against humanity. And from the very beginning, from the moment the state of Israel was established, it has been engaged, according to Amnesty International. There's plenty of data. I mean, the report is very comprehensive. They worked many years and had to overcome a lot of hurdles, as you can imagine. And it's a very courageous report. I would take it one step further. I would say that Israel, not that Israel is engaged in apartheid, Israel is apartheid. Israel is apartheid. Israel is not committing a crime against humanity. Israel is a crime against humanity. Now, what the Zionists did, as opposed to South Africa, the South Africans called it apartheid, which is an ugly name, an ugly word. It means separation, it means segregation. They named it Israel. It's biblical. So right away, you've got all kinds of Christians around the world going, oh my God, it's Israel. How could it possibly be apartheid? These are Jews. Nancy Pelosi one time said, it's unconscionable to say that Jews would ever support apartheid, as though Jews were somehow, saints. So there's no question. Now, I was born and raised there on the privileged side of the apartheid. And I can tell you categorically, without any doubt whatsoever, it was, and it is, and it will continue to be as long as we allow it to be a brutal form of apartheid. And anybody who wants to deny it, I will challenge them right now and take them with me to Palestine. And they can tell me how it's not apartheid.
Right. Why do you feel that some people are denying that?
Well, I think politicians deny it because for some reason they think that if they support Israel, it makes them look good. And Israel is this, I think there's something wrong here. American politicians have this need to love Israel. It's some kind of a, it's some kind of a madness, I think. It's seriously, it's some kind of a disease. I'm not sure I understand what it is. What we see is that people think that the response to accusations of anti-Semitism is to love Israel. Well, so let's clarify that a little bit. Let's unpack that. Israel is a racist state built on a racist ideology called Zionism, which says that I, as a Jew, as an Israeli Jew, have privileges over the Palestinians in Palestine. I have rights in Palestine that Palestinians do not have. And just yesterday, one of Israel's senior ministers, the minister of national security, nonetheless, stood in front on national TV and said it outright. I have more rights on the, than any Arab does, in this country. And of course, that's kind of been the practice anyway. So to say that the answer to anti-Semitism is a racist ideology and an apartheid state is absolute madness. Any form of racism, if it's anti-Semitism, any sort of form of supremacy, including Zionism, needs to be rejected completely. There should be no tolerance for racism, period. Zionism, like anti-Semitism, like white supremacy, these are all forms of racism and should all be rejected. The idea that you answer accusations of anti-Semitism by saying you support Israel is absolutely ludicrous.
I know. I think some people feel like that's the correct response. And some of those people that feel that way are RFK Jr. I want to show you this clip here. Now, this was an event that RFK Jr. had in New York City with Rabbi Shmuley. One of the clips that came from this discussion, it was a longer discussion, but this one, RFK Jr. says Israel is unique in the Middle East because they only attack military targets. I want you to hear this, and I want to get your opinion on this as well.
Israel is unique in the Mideast for saying we're only going to attack military targets. And they're very, very disciplined about doing so. Palestine, the Palestinian Authority, in contrast, follows a long tradition of deliberately targeting civilians. So anybody, and not only that, but they have a pay-to-slay policy. That is the official policy of the Palestinian Authority. If you kill a Jew, not a member of the IDF, if you kill any Jew, you are going to get awarded with pay for life. And if you go to jail or you're killed, your family will get payments for life. And the official policy of Hamas is the genocide of all the Jews. So they consider, and this, by the way, in 1948, when Israel was attacked at its birth, the plans were captured of Syria and Egypt and the other nations, and their plan was complete extermination of the Jews. They took the side of Hitler during World War II. They lost the war, and the practice and the policy of all those nations is to kill individual civilians, whereas Israel does the opposite. It only attacks military targets.
Okay, so I would like to hear what you have to say in response to that statement there from RFK Jr. What do you think about that when he says that Israel is only attacking military targets? And I bring up the example of the Palestinian journalist that was shot and killed. We also brought up examples of one of the hospitals was actually bombed, and a school as well. What do you think about that statement that RFK Jr. made?
It's grotesque. It's absolutely grotesque that he would sit there on the same sofa with that racist, Zionist loudmouth, the Shmuley Boteach character, and spew these racist, filthy, abhorrent lies. None of what he said in that clip, and I've watched this clip, I've watched the entire thing several times, trying not to throw up as I was doing it, is absolutely grotesque that he would sit there and spew these racist, vile accusations against Palestinians. Let me tell you something, and to the listeners, Palestinians have never had an army. They've never had a tank. They've never had a military force. They've never had a helicopter or a fighter plane. Israel has been murdering thousands and thousands of Palestinians wholesale. There is no Palestinian military. There's never been one. In 1948, Israel expelled close to 1 million Palestinians. God only knows how many were massacred along the way. Massacres in Lid, in Ramle, in Jaffa, in Dir Yassin, in Jerusalem, in the Galilee, massacres in the Nakab in the south, wholesale massacres in 1948. And to this day, these massacres continue. When Israel bombs Gaza, they are massacring civilians, and they do this on a regular basis from the air. It is an absolute, and I'll say it again, an absolutely grotesque lie. Every word he said there was absolutely false. Israel has been targeting civilians because Palestinians are civilians. Sure, they've had militias here and there, trying to fight, but the vast majority of Palestinians, there's never been, like I said, there's never been a Palestinian military force, and Israel is massacring thousands wholesale. Shirin Abu Akleh that you mentioned, there was a targeted assassination. A 2-year-old boy a couple months ago, Muhammad Tamimi from the village of Rabi Saleh, was targeted shot in the head, and on and on and on. I mean, the examples go on forever. For him to sit there and spew these lies is absolute madness. And whoever it was in his campaign that thought that this was a good idea ought to be fired, because he lost serious supporters. He lost some very serious supporters. Many of them I know, that I meet with, that I talk to here in Washington, D.C. and around the country. He lost some very serious supporters by sitting there and spewing these lies. The United States gives $3.8 billion in foreign aid to a country that's rich, that doesn't need foreign aid, is an apartheid state, as it was made very clearly by a report by Amnesty International, and of course countless testimonies by people who are from there, like myself and others. And it is absolutely absurd that they give all this money and that Americans are supporting this. Americans need to know that Israel is a racist state engaged in genocide and ethnic cleansing and apartheid. And there needs to be this support for Israel, this adoration of Israel. The mayor of New York was just there too. It's like this apartheid Mecca that they all feel that they need to, make pilgrimage to. It's absolutely grotesque.
Well, thank you so much for saying that, because there have been people that have reached out to his campaign to have this conversation with him. Max Blumenthal is one of them that's been trying to have this conversation with RFK Jr. That conversation has not happened, even though RFK said it's supposed to happen. That has not happened, and it's been quite a while. I know other people that have reached out to try to have this conversation with him as well. That conversation is not happening. I don't know what's happening in reference to the campaign, but it is very clear to me that they tend to be shielding him from people to have this conversation. And I have to ask why. And I'm curious, where do you think those talking points are coming from? Where is this? Is this quoted elsewhere? Like, where is he getting this rhetoric from?
This is the Zionist playbook. He got it 5 minutes before that. You can see he's still not quite rehearsed, and so some of the lines didn't come out quite right. He was still hesitating. He got that, he got a booklet 5 minutes before, the talking points from Shmuel Boteach that was sitting right next to him. He was spewing these lies. I'm sure I don't know if he had a teleprompter, but you could tell that he wasn't even rehearsed well enough to spew these lies, because you can't make this stuff up. This is the Zionist playbook. This is the Zionist narrative. It's lies and racism all put together into this narrative that, for reasons beyond understanding, even though I think many people know they're lies, they continue to repeat them as though they're the truth. And so, I know about these conversations. He's not going to engage, certainly not publicly, with anybody. Once he put his arm around that racist that was sitting next to him on that sofa, that racist, Zionist, hateful, terrorist, violence-supporting Shmuel Boteach, he supports every despicable crime, every massacre that Israel commits. He stands up there and supports it. When RFK Jr. put his hand around that man, that was it. The game over. I don't know why anybody should even consider sitting with RFK Jr. and talking to him about this. He went way too far, as I'm concerned, to for anyone like on our side to be willing to engage with him. He didn't have to do this, and he did it anyway.
Well, what's interesting is Dennis Kucinich is the campaign manager. Dennis Kucinich spoke out years ago in favor of the Palestinian struggle. So that I think that's where the confusion is for me. Like Dennis Kucinich knows that this is not correct.
Yeah, it's confusing to many people. It was confusing to me too. And I don't know. So he made a strategic decision that I believe is catastrophic, because now it paints his candidate as a fool and a supporter of apartheid, but supporter all the way. Not even, he didn't even leave any room for any wiggle room there. He went all in with his support for this racism, and he's supposed to be the guy that's challenging the narrative, the official narrative. Somebody made a decision. I think whoever made that decision, if it is Kucinich, it was a catastrophic decision.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about is I've actually seen video footage of Ethiopian Jews also in Israel dealing with similar situations as the Palestinians. They're being told to get out. Some of them were actually born there. I'm sure you know about the history about that, but some of them were actually born there, and they're being told that they're not wanted there either. And I do feel like a lot of times when we talk about Israel, we talk about what's happening with the Palestinian people, but I do want people to understand that there's also a group of Ethiopian Jews, and they are Jewish, for people who don't understand, but they are Jewish. They're also being told to leave. Why do you think that is?
Well, there are two groups, I think, that we need to discuss, and sometimes people confuse them. You've got the Ethiopians who were brought there, and then you have Sudanese asylum seekers. And 20 or so years ago, Israel allowed the Sudanese asylum seekers to come in because it felt it would make it look good. And then about 10 years ago, Israeli society, which is an inherently very racist society, says, oh, we don't want these black people here. They're having children, they're getting married, they're staying. We want the purity of the Jewish race, or Jewish, whatever the hell it is they call it, and we can't have these people here. So then there was a popular call, a call from people, from society, saying we don't want these people, kick them out, send them home, and that's been the policy ever since. They put them in jails and so on and so forth. The Ethiopian Jews, they're being treated terrible because they're black. The Sudanese are black too, but they're black asylum seekers, which really have no hold anyway. The Ethiopian Jews were brought there, and they're supposedly Jewish, and so it's a Jewish state, whatever. So you can't really kick them out, but they're treated horribly. There were massive protests by that community maybe a year or so ago, where they were calling out saying, "We're not Palestinians. Why are you treating us like this? Stop and frisk." I mean, everything by the racist, handbook is being done to them. Israel is a racist society. When the Jews from Arab countries immigrated to the young Israel in the 50s, the community in Baghdad, the Jewish community in Baghdad, this was like the elite of the elite. It was one of the most respectable Jewish communities in the world, wealthy and highly educated and highly respected. When they landed, they were sprayed with DDT and sent to camps. Nobody cared if they were doctors, if they were educated, if they're educators, whatever the case may be. They were Arabs and they were brown. So they're treated horribly to this day. And Jews from all over the Arab world came, from Morocco, from Yemen, from all of the entire Arab world. Jewish people came when Israel was established. And they were treated horribly. And there was actually, a lot of people don't know this, but in the 70s, there was a Black Panther movement, an Israeli version of the Black Panther movement, by Jewish people who came from Arab countries, because they were treated so badly. And, they're brown skinned, they're darker skinned than myself. My family comes from Europe. And the basic concept in Israel, just like in any racist society, is that whiteness means privilege. And if you're dark, then you're probably stupid, then you're probably lazy, then you're probably violent. And this they say this about these Jewish communities who came, and like I said, were some of the most respectable communities anywhere. So it's a very racist, it's a racist society through and through.
This is the point too I want to point out to people when we talk about the difference between whether or not it's about race or whether or not it's about religion. Again, the Ethiopian Jews are practicing Judaism. So that right there is a perfect example to point to people and to explain to them, like, obviously there's something more here. It's really disturbing to me when I see politicians like Hakeem Jeffries, Richie Torres, who basically have become shills like for the state of Israel, defended at all costs. Don't want to talk about the Palestinian people. And it's really disturbing to see that for those of us living in the United States. It's like, how can you not stand with the Palestinian people, especially for those that are African American? How can you not stand with them? At one point in time, there was a movement where African Americans in this country stood with the Palestinian people. And I feel like along the way, that's kind of gotten lost.
Well, I think the people who did stand with the Palestinians were more like Panthers, were more people. These are groups that are very, very progressive anyway. None of them, it was not part of the establishment. Now that these politicians have become part of the establishment, they're drinking the same Kool-Aid. And to be quite honest, it's puzzling. I mean, it's beyond belief. I was in South Africa, and I was interviewed by South African TV. And when I was there, the Jewish community, the Zionist community, brought in an Israeli, who supports, not like me, who is anti-Zionist. And they had us both on the show. And it's available on YouTube, South African TV interview. And at one point, now South Africans can tell, and they've known that Israel is an apartheid state all along. And so the host, who was a Black African, was looking at the two of us, and he says to me, "Can you explain why it's apartheid?" Which, of course, is very easy to do. Then he looks at the other guy and he says, "Can you explain how it's not apartheid?" And for about 20 seconds, this is on live TV, the guy just had his mouth open and he had nothing to say. And then he said, "Oh, well, we can't compare." Then he kind of remembered the talking point. "Oh, we can't compare." That was his talking point. And so the supporting apartheid is absolutely wrong. Supporting racism is absolutely wrong. And for some reason in America, there's a need. American politicians have this need to support Israel, this need to love Israel, this need to send Israel money and weapons. And it's more Americans that need, these American politicians that need to do it for some reason. They have a need to do it than actually, Israel needs the money
Can we talk about who the land belongs to? Because there are some people that will say, well, the land belongs to Israel. There's some people that will say, well, no, the land actually belongs to the Palestinians originally. There is a graphic that goes around, I think it's pretty viral, where it shows how once upon a time it was all green and it says Palestine. And then as the picture continues, you see less and less green. So it shows that the Palestinian people are being, slowly pushed out.
Yeah, so let me reference two books. One is a book by a Palestinian, a well-known historian called Nur Masalha, and he published a book a few years ago called Palestine: A 4,000-Year History. It's not the biblical Zionist hocus pocus mythology. It's history, pure and simple. And he shows how historically that land was referred to as Palestine going as far back as the Pharaohs and the Babylonians and the Assyrians, all empires which ruled in the region. Herodotus, the father of the Greek father of history, of the science of history, the Greek philosophers who visited the country, everybody called it Palestine. In 1948, Palestine was a thriving, wealthy country. Thriving, well, until 1948, I should say. They were exporting barley from the Nakab, from the south, to the UK to make beer. They were exporting cotton, again, to the British textile industry. They had the Jaffa oranges. They had citrus that they were exporting, olive oil, and on and on and on and on and on. In 1948, suddenly, that in rich history, this entire country that was known as Palestine everywhere. Look at any map, look at literature. It was always called Palestine. Suddenly, all of that was forgotten. The name was changed, and a group of settlers who happened to be Jewish, of colonizers, stole the cities, stole the produce from the fields, stole the money the people had in the banks. See, people had money in the banks, and there were big companies, and there was a lot of wealth. They stole entire cities, with buildings and hospitals and schools, and of course people's homes. They stole a wealthy country, stole it, kicked out almost 1 million people, massacred God only knows how many, because the massacres are still being uncovered till this day. Massacres that took place then are being uncovered and discovered to this day. And they created this myth that this land belongs to the Jews. They created the myth that these Jews came from Europe and made the desert bloom. The Nakab, the southern half of Palestine, called the Nakab. It's a desert, but it's a very fertile desert, most of it. And there are aerial photos that the British took in the early 20th centuries when they occupied Palestine. And you see the entire Nakab. You can see cultivated lands. The Palestinian Bedouin, who are semi-nomadic and live in that part of the country, they're farmers. They engage in agriculture. That part of the desert was in full bloom. Israel destroyed it all. They destroyed it. Now, by the way, the Palestinians who live in that part of the country, who are farmers, are prohibited from engaging in agriculture. Only Israeli settlers, only Jewish Israeli settlements are allowed to engage. And this is, by the way, these are citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel. Only Israeli Jews are allowed to engage in agriculture in that part of the country. If I wanted to go tomorrow, I could have a ranch the size of, any size I wanted, and it would all be subsidized. I'd have all the water I want, all the support I want. A Palestinian Bedouin whose land this is cannot engage in agriculture, and their towns are, they don't get water, they don't get electricity, they don't get roads. I mean, they're in terrible condition. And these are Palestinian citizens of Israel. So to claim that somehow, because maybe 3,000 years ago, there was a tribe there called the Hebrews, and today, maybe some Jews are somehow related to that ancient tribe, that today I have the right to kick out Palestinians from their land, take their home, take their water, take their country, and it's somehow legitimate. Again, this is unbelievable. This is incredible. See, crazy.
Yeah, these are the types of things like what you just said. Like, we'll show people like those facts and figures. We'll show people evidence of that. We showed people the video that went viral on Twitter showing that they were cementing like the water like wells and things like that. And some people just look at it and say, oh, why? I don't know about that. I have to look into that. But you know about everything else when it comes to Israel, Palestine. Like, it's just, to me, it just seems like I wonder how much of this, especially in reference to politicians and candidates, how much of this is tied to the lobby, so to speak. And that's why some people are saying what they're saying, or they're afraid to speak out in support of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, of course it is. And I said I was going to reference two books. I only referenced one. The other book came out a couple of years ago, and it's called Palestinian Refugees in International Law. And talk about reparations. It describes precisely how much was stolen and the value. I mean, what's the value of a city? It's common. This is commonwealth, and so on. And so that book is also outstanding, and it demonstrates precisely what was there and what was stolen. But yes, now if we're going to talk about the Israeli lobby, the Zionist lobby. People always, I think, imagine a bunch of people in suits, on Capitol Hill, talking to congressmen and stuff like that, talking to members of Congress and stuff like that. So there's two things to remember or to realize. One is the Zionist lobby has been in action for more than 100 years, long before the state of Israel was established. And they learned very quickly that here in America, all politics is local. So if you run for school board, if you run for city council of the smallest city in America, if you run for mayor, if you run, of course, for police chief, the smallest cities and towns in America, you will be contacted by a local Zionist organization. You will be invited to a junket to go to Israel, all expenses paid. They will make sure that you come back and you are loving Israel all the way, and you will talk about Israel the way they want you to. And so they operate like I said, very locally. They operate also in education. They make sure that social studies textbooks in middle school describe that country the way they want to describe. And they provide teachers. They go to all the social science conferences. They provide teachers with curricula. They provide them with, glossy material and all the stuff and seminars that the teachers can get continuing education units for, and on and on and on. They work in philanthropy. I lived in San Diego for a long time. The Jacobs family, they're Qualcomm. They're, very wealthy family. They philanthropy, all of anything in San Diego that you look at is Jacobs. It was donated by Jacobs, and it's a Zionist family. So you've got all these areas that are very local, all in which they operate. So by the time somebody runs for office, national office, they've already been indoctrinated. They've already been convinced. And then they're invited to trip, and they meet Netanyahu, and they meet a president, and they meet a general, and they take a trip to, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. The Zionist lobby is far more than what happens in Washington, D.C. They work in the African-American churches. They're in the Latino churches. They are inviting, they have these special trips for professionals, for chefs, and for whatever all kinds of other yuppie kind of professions. And they take them on these discovery tours to show them how wonderful and complicated and complex Israel is. They are everywhere, and they are very smart. And we who are on the side of justice, we who care for justice in Palestine, we're so far behind, because what they managed to do is completely dismantle any entity that represents Palestinians. There is no entity that represents Palestinians, certainly not in Washington, D.C., but not in Palestine either. There's nothing.
This sort of reminds me of what happened in the Dominican Republic. And I don't know if you've seen documentaries about this, but Henry Louis Gates did a documentary about this, and where he compared the Dominican Republic to Haiti, and he went to both countries. And in the Dominican Republic, one of the things that documentary revealed is that they tried to actively erase the African history in the Dominican Republic and just keep the Spanish history. And that's kind of what this reminds me of.
Yeah, I mean, the story of Palestine is I mean, it's unique in first of all the fact that Americans are giving Israel almost $4 billion a year. I mean, first of all, why give a rich country foreign aid, and never mind why give a racist country foreign aid. But why is America giving Israel $3.8 billion? And that's just the official figure. There's a lot more that goes there, but many more billions that go there. But why? Why is this taking place? And so Americans are complicit unless they stand up against and fight it. Unless they stand up and resist with Palestinians, Americans are complicit. The second thing is the reality in Palestine is that over all of historic Palestine, now, I reject the name Israel. I refuse to call it Israel. So, the entire country, which is Palestine, today there are about 12 million people living there. About 7 million of them are Palestinians. The majority of the population in Palestine today are Palestinians, plus you've got millions of Palestinians who are outside in refugee camps, who are not allowed to return, who are denied the right to return to their homes by Israel. So the Palestinians are the majority of the population, and the smaller minority wants the world to think that it's their country, that they have the rights, they need to weaponize themselves all day long, even though they really don't have an enemy. Palestinians never had a military force, so there's no threat. And this is something that Americans have accepted and continue to accept and refuse to break away. And a lot of times I'll talk to people who kind of agree with what I say, but then they say, yeah, but you know what? I still think Israel has a right to exist. I still think we should have a two-state or something. I'm like, why? Why in the world would you agree that an apartheid regime has any kind of legitimacy? Other than if you are a racist.
And how can they have the two-state solution at this point in time when there's too many? I feel like there's way too many settlements. So how could that even be a possibility?
There was never going to be a two-state solution. The two-state solution is a Zionist idea
This is crazy. Like, there's so much. This is so informative. I hope people are learning something that are watching this tonight, because I feel like this is not the mainstream message that most of us get or receive, at least in this country. Do you think, as time goes on, and particularly because there has been more investigative journalism taking place in Israel, like people like Max Blumenthal, he's been to Gaza, he reported from there. I think Kim Iverson was there as well at one point. Do you think more Americans are starting to wake up to the plight of the Palestinian people?
On the margins, nowhere near where it needs to be. It's on the margins. I mean, when Americans mobilize, they mobilize. Like, in Vietnam, they mobilized around civil rights in the 60s. At one point, they mobilized. Now it's like nobody mobilizes. Nobody gives a damn, And in terms of information, the problem is that all the information is on what's considered the fringe. I'll plug in my book here, the book right behind me here, The General Son. And so one of the things that I hear from people is that they like to give it to their friends who still think Zionism is a good idea, who still support Israel, because it shows my path from being raised as, being a young, proud Zionist with a father who was a general and a grandfather who was, all these family members who were like really important people in the state, and then taking this journey into Palestine. And so the reader takes the journey with me, and gradually you go through the same experiences I go through. And then you see the conclusion that I reached, and then hopefully the readers, eventually do too. But it's a very helpful tool, because a lot of people struggle with this issue. They hear the facts, they hear the narrative, and they're somehow emotionally still tied to the idea of Israel. And people say this to me all the time. My best friend is Jewish. We've been friends for 30 years. I don't want to bring it up. I don't want to ruin the friendship, or my son-in-law or my neighbor, whatever the case may be. And I'm thinking, what if they were white supremacists? Would you still give them a pass? What if they were Nazis? Would you still give them a pass? I mean, at what level, who gets a pass? Why is it that people who support Israel get a pass? Why is it so? Do Jews get a pass regardless, just because they're Jewish? So there should be no Jewish people in jails. There should be no Jewish people who, held accountable for anything. Why is it that a Jewish person who openly supports violence, terrorism, racism, apartheid gets a pass? Because it's that thing that I just described is called Israel. Why? Why do Israelis get a pass at perpetrating these crimes against humanity? I don't know if people know this. The term crime against humanity was coined. The idea of crimes that are so heinous that they're called crimes against humanity was coined after the Holocaust. After the genocide of the Jews by the Nazis, the world realized that there are such crimes that are so horrific that they're designated as crimes against humanity. The state of Israel is engaged in crimes against humanity. And they get a pass? Why?
That's a very good question. Oh my gosh, Miko. I think everyone should start with, what do you think people should start? Like, if they're trying to find out about this for the first time, do you feel they should start with your book, The General's Son, or you feel like they should start somewhere else and then work their way up?
Well, I'll tell you two more things about my book. I mean, I want to plug it, but not too obviously. So when the book came out, Alice Walker, the great, wonderful Alice Walker, wrote that it was the most hopeful thing she'd ever read about Palestine. And then we asked her for a little blurb, and she wrote an entire foreword and dedicated a poem. And it's in the book. So that's one thing. I mean, somebody like that, who, you know, is clearly a great person, a great writer, and also a person of great conscience, that was her take. The other thing is, I hear from a lot of people, I get requests all the time from people, oh, can you send me a book and dedicate it to my friend so-and-so because they're struggling with this? And I think it is. It's a great, because the way the book is written, it's a memoir. It's my personal story. And when you read about all these great family members of mine who were really instrumental in establishing the state of Israel and then operating it for the first few decades, and my loyalty and my sense of duty and my military service and my dad's military and all that kind of stuff. And then you see the break. And then you get into the part, which is the subtitle, The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. So now we're talking about, so wait a minute, where's Palestine? Because I was born in Israel, I thought, so where's Palestine? And how come I was suddenly, who are these people? I just thought, because we know them, Israeli Street call them the Arabs of Israel. The Arabs of Israel. So now they're not the Arabs of Israel. Actually, they have their own name and they have their own nationality and they have their own kind of unique, independent characteristics and so on. And then at the end, you go, wait a minute, this is Palestine, and this is Palestine, and this used to be Palestine, and this town right here sits on destroyed villages, and that town over there sits on ruins of villages, and the Tel Aviv University sits on ruined villages, and Tel Aviv Airport sits on occupied city of Lid, and what the hell's going on here? And that's the journey that I take. And I meet Palestinians who lost loved ones, Palestinians who had, who spent many years in prison. My personal story, my sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. And that kind of was what propelled me into this, into this need to engage. And so you go through all of that in the story with me. And it's a lot easier than, hearing somebody just, the politics, just academically discussing it or anything like that. Because you see the landscape, you meet the people, you see their homes through the story.
One more question for you, Miko. How are you received when you go back to Israel now that you've written these books? How are you received by the community?
Well, like I said, I don't call it Israel. So I go to Palestine. I go there quite a bit. I have family there. Still a rather large family. My mother's still alive. And I have a lot of work that I do there. I mean, my work involves a lot of travel. I'm going there a lot. And so work with my Palestinian brothers and sisters. How I'm received, depend. I mean, my family loves me because we're family. And so we try to, just do family stuff because it's a very difficult conversation to have. Israelis, by and large, don't want to have this conversation with somebody like me. It pushes them to a point where they're feeling really uncomfortable. So I'll give you an example. I was interviewed a couple of times by Israeli TV. And once I was actually in Palestine. One time they came here, but once I was actually in Palestine and they followed me around. And at the end, they're pretty shocked. They spent a few days, I told them what I do. And I said, if you want to come with me, you can come with me if you want. which for them was, oh my God, we have to go to East Jerusalem. Oh my God, we have to go to all these places. You know, we have to bring guns. We have to bring guards. And so I made it clear. I said, if I see one gun, I'm out. I'm not part of this. But anyway, at the end, they said, we agree with you, you know, especially the producers and kind of the TV people. They're kind of a little more progressive. At least they think they are. And I said, you know, we agree with you 95%. And I said, you know, damn that 5%. I wonder what that 5% is. And that 5% is giving up the privilege. Understanding that actually it's not even giving up the privilege, it's sharing the privilege, because Palestine is a rich country. There's plenty there to go around for everyone. It's giving up the privilege and sharing it with everybody so that the Palestinians have the same privileges, the same rights as we Israelis do. And that's the 5%. So these are these very progressive Israelis that agree with me 95%. But you know what? Taking it to the point where the actually Palestinian refugees are allowed to return, taking it to the point where there's actually justice, where there's actually real equality, where there's actually a democracy, because the country's never been a democracy, that's going too far for them.
One more question, Miko. I know I said one more, but one more question for reals, because I don't want to forget about this one. Yeah. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Do you believe this is the way to truly help the Palestinian people?
Without a doubt. Without any doubt. There must be boycotts. Now, you know, people think, oh, boycott, divestment, oh, it means we don't buy, you know, Israeli avocados or, you know, whatever. Yeah, that's important. Don't buy the Israeli avocados, of course. Boycott means we have to work so that the Olympic Committee does not allow Israeli teams to compete. Boycott means that Israeli institutions are banned from participating, whether it's academically, culturally, politically, diplomatically, sporting events, out, just the way it was done with apartheid South Africa. You know, the Olympics in Tokyo Olympics, there was a judo practitioner from Algeria. And when he came up, it was his turn. And can you imagine, you know, an Olympic athlete? You know how hard you worked. Can you imagine? And then you get to that point, right? We're actually at the Olympics. And he had to compete. Fathi Nourin was named. Fathi Nourin. And he had to compete against an Israeli. And he refused. He was thrown out of the Olympics. He was thrown out of the International Judo Federation. He's prohibited from ever competing. He gave up his entire career. And me, I had a career in martial arts. To me, he won the match without even stepping on the mat. Because in life, I think in general, but certainly in martial arts, moral issues are more important than, you know, winning a game or winning a match. Now, here's the problem. Good for him. I mean, he's a hero. There's no question. He should not have had to do it. The Olympic Committee had to make sure that there's no Israeli team participating because they are representing an apartheid state. They're representing a state that is engaged in apartheid, period. It's not up to the individual athlete who worked so hard to get there. Good for him for making the sacrifice, but that shouldn't be his. He shouldn't have to make that sacrifice. He shouldn't be made to be placed in that position. You know, that's what I'm talking about. Sanctions, there should be severe sanctions against Israel. Severe sanctions. More than that, I say the Sixth Fleet that is situated in the Mediterranean should go to the shores of Gaza and make sure the siege on Gaza is lifted immediately, and that there's a no-fly zone so Israeli planes can't keep flying and bombing Gaza, and that the people of Gaza receive the water and the food and the medical care that they need finally. Why are 2 million people locked up in a concentration camp? You know, when Israel bombs Gaza, you can see it from the beaches in Tel Aviv. The beaches in Tel Aviv are these really fun, wonderful beaches. You can see the smoke. You think people stop going to the beach or playing volleyball or getting drinks or eating?
Nope.
Not for 1 second, you know? So that's what BDS is. That's what boycott is. That's what sanctions are. You know, yeah, avocados, oranges, all that stuff, that's important, Israeli products. But usually they hide it. Now they hide it. If it's made in Israel, they change it. They say made in Greece. So they do all this kind of stuff, which shows that it's working. But it has to be much more robust. We have to talk about FIFA kicking out Israel. We have to talk about universities and on and on and on. Like I said, that's what BDS is about. And it is absolutely, it makes, first of all, it makes sense, but absolutely is a crucial tool.
Thank you so much, Miko. Thank you so much for coming on. Again, like, where can people follow you to find your work?
Well, MikoPeled.com has almost all my stuff. There's a Miko Peled podcast, a small little podcast that I put out with interviews with people. It's all about Palestine. I write for various, but everything ends up, and I'm on all over social media, so my stuff always ends up, so people can follow me there. It's easy to find my book. It's a very catchy name, so if you put General Sign Miko Peled, it's it comes up. And now I've been on your show, so that's so they can find me here too.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Miko. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.